Welcome to Substandard Roleplaying. I have recovered from the sickness, William, and today the guest is.
Uh, I'm Casey. I'm a regular at the Substandard Roleplaying, if you haven't known me yet. And I also go by Questing GM on YouTube.
And he started uploading again.
Uh, yeah, I was thinking of doing RPG a day, but things
mean-
didn't turn out so well.
I mean,
So
to do it all in a day.
yeah, but yeah, that didn't turn out well. So
Mhm.
hopefully you'll be seeing the channel activated for something else
Oh,
other than
yeah.
RPG a day. Yeah.
We're going to see how things depend with you.
Mm.
So
Actually,
Mhm.
I was kind of happy when you went with that title. It depends, because I think there's one thing that's kind of missing, or
Mhm.
it's always the unspoken thing about when talking about so-called RPG discourse or RPG theory, and it's two words that I don't hear as often, which I think I should be hearing because I'm trying to read between the lines. And those two words is called bias and preferences.
those are good words.
Yeah, it's a term that I've used and in discussion with some other RPG speakers, like say Runeslinger.
Mm.
We use that concept quite often. That some things that we talk about can be very heavily influenced by our own bias and preferences, and sometimes it's useful to acknowledge that, but sometimes it's also useful to just saying, "This is what I think, but what I'm thinking is based on my bias and preferences."
Mm.
So I think that's a very apt and very suitable thing to come with It Depends, because that's pretty much how we talk about RPGs nowadays. It's very hard to be very objective about RPGs because there's just so much that's depending on, and it's not just my personal bias and preferences. You're dealing with a whole table of bias and preferences, the people that you're playing with. So that's a factor too, and it depends. It comes to a point where it sort of depends. Am I going to be staying or keeping my bias and preferences, or are we going to compromise on that thing to some extent?
Right, like how far is far enough to come halfway with other people?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I really liked it at the end when Anthony mentioned that his answer for everything was "it depends."
Yeah.
Because I like that flavor of "it depends," because that ends up being a very useless footnote at the end of any video or blog post.
Yeah.
It's like, well, this is just what I do. You don't have to ascribe to this is the way I think it has to be done, and there's no other way.
I mean, you could, but it comes to that point where you could, but you're going down the path where what happens if someone disagrees with you,
right?
And that someone happens to be on your table.
And like, how dogmatic are you willing to be when it compromises your ability to have fun?
Right, exactly. That's why this whole bias and preferences thing comes in.
Yeah.
And it's not really wrong for someone to have a different bias and preference.
Mm-hmm.
It's a conflicting one, sure, but it's a matter of how you handle the conflict when you recognize that you both or several people come from different places. And an RPG session can kind of only work when everyone does come to a compromise,
right,
or come to a consensus. No, if one person gets it their way, somebody is giving up something.
Right. And I mean, we've definitely like hit impasses like that in the Desolation and the Slay thing.
Right.
I don't think we had like many like huge conflicting moments.
Yeah.
But I think in like roleplay flavor, or maybe like where the story went at certain points, we're like, I'm not a fan of this, but it's okay because there's something else in it for me anyway.
Yeah, and then that's the other thing about talking about this whole compromising thing. Compromising is quite a big part of role-playing games, I think. So it's a give and take relationship in some ways. It's just that there can be discussions to be had about who should be giving, i.e. the GM or the DM, and who's taking. Is the player just always taking? Can the player give back in some form or another to the GM or to the other players? But as long as you just don't recognize, but because you've seen those videos where, you know, if I'm the GM, I would have done this. If I was the player, I was entitled to this. That sort of thing.
The really judgmental one's like, oh well, your GM doesn't understand the game and he's being unreasonable with you.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe sometimes it's not just because the person was being totally unreasonable, but I think it's more of both sides not recognizing what each other want out of the game, and and both sides being unwilling to give each other what they want out of the game, and that just this just leads down to a very destructive path.
Right. It's my turn solutions. To have fun.
Yeah. So that's why that whole saying of as long as we have fun, like what is that exactly? That's the question of bias and preference. What is it that you find fun? And it doesn't always have to be conflicting fun. It can be I find this fun and you find that fun, and let's try to find a tangent between those two sometimes. Right. Yeah.
So in our first topic of rules versus rulings, do we play the game or take charge of the game? What is your preference? Where do you tend to lean?
I think it's probably going to sound like a broken record at this point, from everyone who's you've invited to talk on this. But it depends on the game.
Right.
It depends on the game. Some games are very good at giving you rulings, and they tell you how to rule this, how to rule that, how to rule this. Some games just give you rules, and it just goes hands off. Right. You go figure out the rest yourself, and they give you the permission to go figure it out yourself, or they don't tell you about go figure it out yourself, or they actually do tell you how you should go figure it out yourself. So I think as someone who's interested in reading rules and trying to understand them, you probably heard some of us say, first run of the rules, we try to play closely to the rules as possible. And it's not because that's our style, but it's more like I just want to poke holes at everything. Yeah. I just want to see the mechanic work. I want to see how the joints move. I want to see how the gears turn. And we can have our own thoughts about how it works during that first session or first campaign or whatever. And then we reserve and then we revise and reflect on that after that whole first session is done. And that's where we decide, okay, maybe this is where we need to tweak some few things, and that's where we start making rulings over the rules, because maybe certain rules just didn't make sense. Maybe certain rules were just being too clunky, or it just impeded on our imagination the way we thought it was going to happen. Or maybe it was just rules that we didn't enjoy in the spirit that it was made for. Sometimes we just are just plain lazy and we just want an easy way to do things.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I've definitely done that a lot. It's just like, I don't feel like control effing in the PDF.
Right. That's right.
Well, what do you think is fair? Let's work it out. Let's negotiate.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those. It's kind of one of those like very old original OG tactics of saying, if you can't find the rules of the thing, just make a ruling for it, and then we figure it out at the end of the session.
Right.
So it really depends on what kind of game you're running. I think if you're looking like, despite how D&D gives you that kind of spirit of rulings over rules, then that's a whole different argument. It's a very heated debate subject about that. But it's actually very rules heavy. I won't say it's rulings heavy. It's a very rules heavy game, especially in the context of 5e, and
very mechanically dense.
Yes, and that's why rulings, that whole attitude of going with rulings, is a bit dangerous for a game like 5e, because you just don't know what you're gonna break by making a ruling.
Right.
Whereas you have something a bit more freeform, like say maybe PBTA, or to some extent maybe Ubiquity, that's where you're given more freedom to make rulings without having the fear of breaking something.
Because those games have like breaks built into the system, so if it starts breaking, then there is like backlash in the machine of the game.
The game is designed or written in such a way that you are expecting to be making more rulings than referring to the rules. Yeah. So it really depends how the game is made and how it's written and what are the design intentions. Because if there's another way you could look at it, is that if the game is rules heavy, it's just a primitive computer game where the GM is not acting as a GM, being part of the improvisation fun, or he's just his job or his brain power is taken up as being referee.
Yeah, like you're just the programming behind the game.
Right.
With a skill check, you might literally just be giving dialogue options. Like you rolled high, here's the good one. You rolled low, here's the bad one.
Yeah, right. That's right. So, but then again, there's nothing wrong with those kind of games. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, one of them happens to be the most popular role-playing game in the world.
Right, and I mean, hell, I did that a little bit with Desolation as well, which is Ubiquity. It was like, it depended when we had that raid coming in with the Eclipse. It was like, well, if you didn't roll too well, everybody dies today.
Yeah. And there was certainly no rules for that in the Desolation or Robo, but because it embraced this whole role-playing, storytelling, style point system, it was pretty much, just let the story or the narrative dictate the flow. Whereas in certain games, it's let the rules dictate the flow, and then the story sort of seeps in or something like that.
Yeah, like incidentally, it's like, oh well, I'm a hermit, so maybe I met this squirrel one day.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't really see that as a problem or as a question. Like, and maybe that's my thing. Maybe that's my thing where when I talk about a lot of topics, I start with the system,
right?
And then the next thing is the people.
What rules are we dealing with, and what kind of asshole is gonna sit at my table this week?
Yeah. Well, asshole is a better way to put it.
If you were to be entombed with one game, its complete works or single book or whatever, to be rediscovered and enjoyed in the future, what would it be? Talking about biases.
Yeah. And that's a kind of funny thing because I'm not the kind of guy who has favorites or anything. I kind of like to like things on their own face value.
Right.
Like, I like this because it's this, and I like that because of that, but I don't like one over the other. Well, maybe for some. I don't know. At this stage, I don't think I found the one yet that I would like to be buried with or preserve for future archaeological discovery. But if there's one that I think I would like to explore more, and I have a feeling that it has a lot more interesting things going on to it than some other games right now, I think it would be something 2D20. And the only one that I have any real experience with is Star Trek Adventures.
Right.
Yeah.
I've only also played the Star Trek Adventures.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of keen and interested to see what they have in the SRD that they just released. Because I'm kind of interested of what's really underneath the hood and how do they adapt the main engine to all these different settings.
Right.
But for me, I think 2D20 right now, I think it just has all the things that I look for in RPGs that it's not too rules heavy.
Right.
But at the same time has some sort of flexibility to form a narrative, so to speak. Which is something that I had to relearn because after playing, the Dungeons and Dragons for multiple editions, I might have just got distracted or lost sight at some point that it was really more about the numbers.
Yeah, definitely something I ran into a lot with D&D players.
Yeah, and the thing was, I felt that maybe the numbers was telling the story, but it turns out that given how the direction of D&D went and is going currently, no, I think it becomes too different. It has become two games in one. You could play the numbers game, or you could play the pure role playing side of the game, and forgo the numbers, and the GM kind of has to make a choice of what kind of game he wants to play with D&D, which is strange to say, but 2D20 I feel has that way of I won't say balance, but it knows that it's a role. It knows itself as a role playing game. That for telling stories, and they're giving you tools and mechanics that supports that rather than the other way around.
Right. It's a role-playing game, not a game role-playing.
Right.
Like, if that's even a intelligent way to put it.
Yeah.
So
But yeah,
that was the thing I spoke about with Thomas, was like one of my key issues with 5e. Dungeons and Dragons, first and foremost, goes, these are the pluses to all of your numbers. And then at the very end is, choose a background to get more stats.
Yeah. And that's the thing, choose a background to get more stats.
Right.
Not choose a background because that's your character.
Yeah, it's like, I don't have this proficiency. Maybe I can, get some luckpicking in here. Well, that's not a skill, but same,
Yeah.
2 out of 3 so far are very system agnostic. So, you and Runeslinger, it's like, it could be a different system a week. There's lots of, like, different interesting things you can do with different systems.
Yeah.
Thomas, you didn't get to watch the video yet. He is very much rooted in 5e.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ideas he puts forward is, like, any system can fulfill the role of any genre.
Right.
So how do you reconcile the fact that, I mean, you really could just, like, 5e convert anything?
Everything, yeah.
And it would still work. Or Modifius, I mean, they convert for, like, there's 12 different settings or something.
Right.
So it's like, why would we spend the time, like, reading all these books, watching Drive Through RPG, like, teaching these to people whenever we want to do something different?
Yeah, but I mean, I think I had this conversation once with one of my local players. Generic systems, and why do we need other systems if we have generic systems that we can fit in and everything?
Rule lights, the 3D6 thing.
Yeah. And I mean, the 2D20 during the 3.1x era, the OGL was like a very big thing. Like literally everything was OGL. But I think I came to realize that, yeah, sure, the OGL and the T20 system back then could be fit into everything, but not everything is fitted for the 2D20 system. And I think a really great example of this is how 2D20 does Star Trek.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not just the dice system, but also this idea that you could play supporting characters as well as your main characters. And that was kind of how it feels in a Star Trek episode, whichever franchise that you're watching. Sometimes certain episodes will focus on only certain characters, and you're playing a whole ship, so you're not really expecting to always see the same few characters at every episode. Somebody needs to get their highlight episode once in a while. So that's the thing. I think having generic systems trying to fit everything, you don't know what is the underlying core motivations or drivers of the generic system. And sometimes when you fit a generic system to a certain IP or a certain setting, you may not be bringing out the best of what the setting has to offer.
Right.
You need to add in. You still need to go in there and you need to add in like extra quirks and twists. Look at how they made Eberron, and they had to add like extra new mechanics into Eberron.
Yeah.
And I would even argue that actually Forgotten Realms, as written by lore, is quite a bad fit with any D&D. Because if you look into what Great Moon talks about and how he describes it, he explains how things work in the world. It doesn't feel like it would perfectly fit with D&D, especially current D&D, because there's just too much. Either there's just too much abstractions that's been taken with the rules, or there's just too much nuances that is lost once it's put into the D&D rule set. So I don't know. I get the understanding of the daunting feeling of, oh, I have to learn a new rule set, but I find that that's taking a very comfortable way of approaching RPGs, and yeah, you just don't want to leave your comfort zone. But I think it's actually more interesting when you go out there and you dare yourself to say, if D&D wasn't so hard to learn, what makes other rules so hard to learn? And you And you might find out that actually D&D is a pretty hard game.
Like you could do, like, I mean, if you could figure out 5e, then there's no reason that you couldn't do Call of Cthulhu for like an Eldritch Noir thing.
Yeah, and you might find games that are actually much lighter than 5e. There's actually a lot of games that are much lighter than 5e. I think rule systems have a way of making you think in a certain way. And some would find that very restricting, but some may also find, constraints breeds creativity.
Right.
That way, right. Which is something that I sort of had to recognize or realize myself, that when I was playing D&D, I think it was AD&D, and I don't think I really had a full grasp of the rules, because I was probably like 10 or something. It was the second edition of AD&D, so there was a very, very dense player's handbook. And since we were so young and we were so excited with the whole notion of playing RPGs, we really went with, this was cool, and let's just find a way to make it work, and we make it work.
Right.
We really didn't care about the whole, rules, must follow the rules sort of thing. I mean, since you brought up character generation,
that's good.
Like how the system sort of either confines you, like Star Trek Adventures again. They just use a life path system. Answer questions. You're creating a person, and he has supposedly gone through certain experiences in their life before they reach the point of play. That's what you do. You just answer questions, and that's what your character is.
Right.
I think it's the same.
I played did the same thing. Guild Wars 2.
Right. So what you get with that, you get a sense of creative gratification that you made something. And not to say that rolling 3d6 and putting all in 6 stats doesn't have the same effect.
Right.
It's just that which is why I'm bringing it up. Like, rolling 6 stats and answering questions is 2 different forms of creativity manifesting.
Right.
And sometimes some people who roll 6 stats and say, "Oh, I wish I could just answer questions and make a character," and some people who are answering questions will say, "Oh, I wish I could just roll 6 stats and get a character." Right. So yeah, I think it's really how the system really affects the way you play, and what happens when you try to step out from that assumptions.
Right.
Yeah. So I think people who like to play role-playing games, to some extent, they are trying to express their creativity in some form, because if they had zero creativity, they probably would have just been better off playing a computer game where everything's just pre-programmed for you and you don't have to think too much about it. Yeah.
I like that point. Everyone's trying to express their creativity in their own way.
Yeah. So I think that's an appeal for role-playing games in particular, compared to other forms of gaming.
Right, or other forms of like media that you can entertain yourself with.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, which is cool for the next talking point. The player skill versus character ability. Is it really what we would do? So, I want to preface it with a thing I was reading. It was a PDF from one of these veteran GME people, and he was talking about almost the difference between like method acting and classical acting. So it's like, when we're role playing, is it helpful to be the character or to act as if the character would, like caricature it, or be ourselves but we're also this thing?
Again, it's one of those, depends on what the game says. Especially when it comes to this whole particular subject of player skill versus what's it, character skill?
Character ability.
Character ability, yeah. I think this is a particular pain point maybe between the old school players of D&D and the more modern one. The old school was more leaning on, it was about player skill, because when you go into a dungeon, when you go to a room in a dungeon, it's more about what you ask for and what you look for, rather than rolling investigation or something like that. So I think that's really how it's the question is really what the system is encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're gonna have a skill that says I can investigate the room by just rolling a dice, everyone's gonna be rolling a dice.
Then that's how the game says to play the game.
Yeah, that's what the game is saying. This
Right.
is how you do it. This is what we are encouraging you to do it. So it's character skill because your character is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas you know, I mean, in some systems where maybe such skills don't exist, and maybe it's on genre, like say a detective game, like maybe Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green. I think Delta Green doesn't specifically have a skill where it says that you're supposed to roll to get a skill. In fact, the GM is the GM is told that you give them every clue.
Yeah.
And you give it to them. If they ask for it, you just give it to them. Yeah, you just hand it to them.
Well,
so
I mean, because that is the genre of Delta Green. It's like, these are like really good. These people are like part of the. Oh, what's a Delta Green?
Yeah, the investigators.
Yeah.
So
my brain just went like SCP Foundation when you said Delta Green. It's like same.
Yeah, so that's how this. That's why I think that's a question to be answered by the system at some point, and then you decide whether you like that or not.
Right.
But I think it's as a player, I think it's kind of good if that you can play both styles. You know when is a good time, or when is the system telling you use your character abilities, and when is the time where you should practice your player ingenuity or your player experience. Yeah. I just don't understand why sometimes that can be a very heated argument, because for me it's pretty much two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And that coin being the system.
And I mainly have only asked this question 3 times is because in preparation for like talking about this, and I can't remember exactly what it was that spurred me on, but I started consuming a lot of content about like modern RPG gaming and the old school revival kind of stuff. And this comes up a lot, where where the main argument I see is that it manifests in roleplay as like in the old school way. You know, it's like I'm going to check for traps by tapping my 10-foot pole all across the floor, and then like I'm going to jam it in the mechanism of the springboard or whatever trap it is. But then the more modern game is like, are there traps? Rolls d20. There are traps. I disarm the traps. Rolls d20. And they paint it a lot like they paint it as like, oh well, I'm not doing this to be biased, but it's pretty clearly biased. Do you think that it would role playing manifest differently in these sorts of situations?
I mean, you could still say I tap the floor with my 10-foot pole when I look through every crook and cranny, and then the GM says roll investigation.
So did you tap in the right places?
No, I mean because the thing about those rolling abilities, it leaves a sort of air of how do you do it, and then we do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like basically how 5e and 3.5 combat was. You only needed to roll d20 to hit someone. You don't have to describe your sword swing to hit someone.
Well, also when you talk about like what a game is trying to serve, or like what it's trying to encourage, like D&D 5e and a couple of other combat games, each round of combat is describing a 6-second slice of action. It's very cinematic.
Yeah.
Whereas something like the design mechanism, they do like blow by blow, because that's actual hitting. Because when you have 115 hit points, what does an axe hitting you look like when it doesn't wind you at all?
Yeah. So that's why that's the sort of the paradox, I would say, that if you're going to encourage people to role play, but why is your monster, or the result of your action translated into numbers? If I was encouraged to role play, then I swing my axe and I chop his limb off. Why is that translated to only losing 5 hit points out of 50?
Right. It's like, well, you're obviously not putting your back into it when you him.
Yeah, but I chop his limb off.
Right. It's like that's the difference. It's like in some games, if we like hit the D&D horse again, it's like It's like early on, 2 swings with a great axe, something dies. And then later on, 5 swings with a magical super sharp great axe, something is not dying.
Yeah. So I think I know this is a very like hated word in some gaming circles, but this is your typical narrative Ludo dissonance. It's the word. Yeah.
Yay.
But it does. I think that concept does hold true to some extent in RPGs. You do see it happen right before your eyes.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I mean, some people will argue that it's just your DM not being a good improviser, or he's not good with descriptions, or you're not helping the DM providing the descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it comes down to why is the system doing this?
Yeah. So it's like, so it would be role playing in accordance with how the system is presenting the game to you.
Yeah, is the system asking for role playing, or is role playing the result of the system? Is a question that you should I would ask myself, bias and preference included.
Right, bias and preference included.
Yeah. It's going to be a very constant answer that everything comes down to system first. We'll figure out what the system says, then we figure out what to do with it. Follow, not follow, like it, not like it. And if you're being very experimental, just go along with it and see what happens. You may actually think, this is a very different way of doing things. So that which sort of answers a bit to your question: if why do we play different systems if we have a generic one that does everything? Because you want to do the same things differently.
Right.
Yeah, and you might find out that the different results, and you might like things done in a different way rather than the same old way done 50 different ways.
Right. Like, I will say, like, if you talk about doing the same thing differently, another thing Thomas brought up was like, a D20 check is like, well, you could just use a D100, a D12, a D6. Who really, like, a check is a check. Ubiquity. A coin flip is a check.
Yeah.
So, but it's different the same.
If you're talking about this whole like success failure way of doing things, like D20 is one way. You can use one dice.
Yeah.
You can use a pool of dice and count the number of successes from there.
Right, like a slave thing.
Like a slave thing, right?
Yeah.
Or World of Darkness, that sort of thing. You could use different dice to roll instead of the same one. I think that's Eclipse Phase, or maybe the Cortex Prime engine that does that. But or is it Savage Worlds? Yeah. So, like I said, there's just so many different ways to try to get to get the same result sometimes. Right. And we had this conversation, I think also with Runeslinger, but in a different platform, where we were talking about what's the purpose of dice. Like, how we started off with a question of how frequent should we be rolling dice. And my argument to that was go read what the rules says about dice rolling.
Right.
And you'll be quite surprised. Some can be very, very thin on the subject, and some can be very, very verbose on the subject. But when they talk about dice rolling, there are certain assumptions built into the dice roll. It's either a representation of the character skill, or it's a representation of maybe just pure luck. Sometimes, like as far as D&D don't try not to tell you that, but then they did just sit in this strange rule where a natural 20 is always a success and a natural 1 is always a failure.
That's a point of contention and a half for me.
Yeah, I mean, they brought it back for 1D&D, so that's back to square one.
We made no progress. Sorry.
And then there are games where they tell you, like, if you roll this number, you get this result, but if you roll a slightly higher number, you get a slightly better result, and vice versa, obviously. Right. So it's really sometimes educational just to go back to the text and see what it says, and you'll be like, oh, okay, now you know what it's doing, and how do you want to try to do this.
That is a cool phrase. How do you want to do this? Jumping off into sandbox to canned story. When do we get off?
All right. This is probably something that, well, some games can answer that question. Some games don't really care about that at all.
Yeah. Like, I mean, in the Star Trek thing, it's very particular about every session's an episode.
Right, yeah. They give you a format of that.
Yeah. And then I noticed that there's the more, like, sandboxy, toolkit systems tend to talk a bit sandboxy and go like, oh, well, here's how you can structure an adventure, and here's hook ideas, and
even those, I would probably lean towards more like they are building towards like a one-off sort of thing. D&D 5e, I wouldn't say so, although the Dungeon Mastering chapter do have that sort of structure into talking about adventure building for their DMG. I think this was actually a very prominent thing, as far as I remember, during the 3.5 DMG. It was sort of the book that sort of introduced me to the idea. You could think of it as a sandbox, or you could think of it as a one-shot, like story-driven thing. But after you come out of that paradigm, and you look at games like Star Trek Adventures, which you think that, all right, this game is asking to be put in a formatted structure. It's like a one episode thing. And then you have like hex crawl like games like Forbidden Lands. Like there's not really an episode, but as you step out from your base and you step off onto different axes, you are building the sandbox as you go.
Right.
Yeah. So that's why I meant like some games talk about this and some games don't talk about this. For me, I think it's sort of. So I think I have two different answers for this. One is determined by the length of play that you are intending to have. Like if it's literally just a one-off, then there's no point building a sandbox for a one-off.
Right. And that would also influence your game system choice.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. And the other way I would answer it is, then I don't think canned games and sandboxes are on the same spectrum. They are two different ways of playing, and they require two different methods of prepping. That's what I've come to learn. I used to be the guy who's like, oh, I don't want to prepare anything. I'll just find a sandbox and I'll just throw everyone in the sandbox and let it go. Let's just see what happens.
Yeah, they'll figure it out. They'll tell me what to
do. And this was the whole point where I was like saying, oh, with this whole emergent game style of gameplay was cool. I don't have a story, they tell me the story sort of thing. But as I was doing this for a few games, I've gradually found out that you're not trading off a sandbox for a prep one shot. You're just switching one way of prep for another, because when you prep a sandbox, you have to know pretty much everything, and anything that is not given to you, you have to make it up. And the worst time to make something up is at the table.
Oh hell no! That is the absolute worst when you put on the corner like that. And I think I've done this I did this for Desolation and for Slayer actually. I originally started prepping them like sandboxes, just going for Desolation was like, let's just aimlessly wander through the desert, and for Slayer I was just like, well, let's go kill stuff and see what happens. And I've shifted into, now there's a narrative that I'm trying to push. Like in Desolation, the library initially was actually supposed to be a physical library that was teleporting. That's why I did that desert you couldn't cross, like the spatial thing. And then the story idea came, and I was like, okay, well now let's move towards this narrative of the struggle between these three settlements. And in Slay, I just kind of happened into the Dark Knight thing. After you guys did that highway shootout, I was like, okay, story starts now.
Right. And that's the interesting thing, because when I was reading Slay Industries, if you read from like cover to cover, you would get the impression that this was meant to be a sandbox.
You would. That's really what my intention was.
And the thing about when I was reading Slay was like, okay, this is meant to be a sandbox,
Yeah.
but every mission is built to be like an episode, like a canned one-off.
Right.
So it even brought me questions of how am I supposed to play this? Am I supposed to do every mission the way the mission is given to me, or am I supposed to practice a bit of some player knowledge about the setting and
Right.
use whatever the setting can provide for me to solve the mission?
Right. Like I know
Right.
There's the pit, and I can go there and talk to people.
Yeah,
That's a common
I know
hangout.
exactly who I should go in and talk to because
Yeah.
I've read it or I've played this setting before.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So that's why I was saying. I mean, you could play Slay like this is the mission, and I've never prepped anything beyond what the mission description says, and we'll just figure it out. Or as a GM, I'm giving you this mission precisely because I know where you're gonna go.
Yeah.
In the sandbox. So I think that's really comes back to the question of length. Like, are we playing this as like we don't know when we're gonna end? We're just gonna stop when we find a good place to stop, or when life takes over. And maybe that's something that's more suited for a sandbox kind of play. But then again, like I said, you have to be ready to be prepared to be prepping for a sandbox rather than prepping for a one shot.
Right. And when you're prepping, there's one rule that you keep in mind above all others. Rule 0 ?
I've watched Anthony's video, and he says genre is his rule 0.
Yeah, spoilers. Thomas says fun is rule 0 for your table. Figure out what fun is and run with that.
Yeah.
I'm
paraphrased
terribly.
Yeah. I think for me, rule 0 is really the book, the text, the core text. Because I mean, we could say like genre, we could say fun, but we can't have fun without following the rules.
Right.
We can have fun by following genre. But then you feel like we're not playing that game that we are playing right now. We could have just played a different game and we went for fun, and then
right.
We could still have fun.
We could still have fun. But
we could still have fun.
But like computer games are fun because they're restricted and there's a directed goal, and this is how you play the thing. Movies are fun because this is the universe and this is the situation we find ourselves in that we're observing.
Right. Yeah. So I think for me, it's really like the rules that we've agreed to play on, and I'm not saying like we should follow all the rules verbatim. Is the rules that we've agreed to play on.
Yes.
We could like have a 500 page, and we say we only want 300 pages of this, and we can dump out the 200 pages worth of worthless rules.
That Zweihander tome sitting on my shelf is crying right now. You've just invalidated a third of its content.
Which is actually, that was kind of how I used to play AD&D because it came to a point where enough is enough, and we just didn't want to continue reading the rules. So it's really the base rules that we've agreed to play on. And the thing is, especially for some games, if we don't have a shared understanding or interpretation of said rules, you're not going to have a good time. You're going to spend the whole, 15 to 20 minutes just arguing about rules.
Right.
And it comes to that dirty part of it where somebody has to make a ruling, and because somebody said so.
Right, and that somebody is the GM who suddenly now isn't getting brought pizza every Friday night when we play the game.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wins in an argument in an RPG.
No, nobody wins. We're all losers because we started arguing in the first place. We got there.
Exactly.
It's just
we lost the moment we argue.
Yeah, it's just a race to the bottom after that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that for me is rule 0. Everything that we've agreed on and that we're willing to play, and if we disagree at something at some point, then we probably miss something at rule 0.
That is cool. And something I didn't get to talk about with the other guys was metagaming. And not in a contentious, like, when is it metagaming, when is it not?
Mm-hmm. Right.
How do you think we should deal with like?
I actually had to think about this one for quite a bit. I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is sounds weird to anyone, or is it a hot take? I don't think anything I think is a hot take, but um, okay. So the examples that we tend to talk when I was introduced to the concept of metagaming, like this player knows the hit points of the goblin because he read it in the monster manual. That's this sort of thing. And anyone who does that, like applying meta knowledge that the character shouldn't have to in-play decisions, is metagaming, and therefore it's bad. Metagaming equals bad. But I've come to realize that there actually is good metagaming.
Is that so?
And and the thing, and first of all, you can't stop a player from metagaming, and once they've come to realize that there's this notion that you can find out information about a game or a mechanic or whatever that they shouldn't be having, you can never close that door. Even though, despite what everyone says, that you don't metagame, that's bad practice. But once the person has realized that what metagaming is and what they can do with it, nobody is going to close that door willingly.
No.
Nobody is going to do it. So I've come to think about why are we fighting against the nature of metagaming?
Right.
Why
is this contentious in the first place?
Yeah, why is this contentious, and why can't we just embrace it? If I'm in a D&D combat for the last 4 hours, and I know that goblin's gonna have 1 hit point left because I read it in the monster manual, I'm gonna kill that goblin so that the game can go on faster.
Right.
So you can have metagaming. You can metagame, but it's what are you metagaming for? What reasons?
What's the accomplishment?
Right. What's the result of the metagaming? If you're metagaming to make the game quote unquote more fun, I perfectly don't see any reason why metagaming should be stopped.
Right.
So I tend to believe there is good metagaming and there's bad metagaming, because everyone's gonna metagame at some point.
At some point, at some level. Like Thomas brought up, like more experienced players helping more new players.
Yeah.
That in itself is a kind of metagaming.
Yeah. Like if I was an experienced D&D player, and I know my newbie player is going to play a bard with and he says, "Oh, I should play 8 charisma because that's in character." If I was if I'm gonna tell the guy that you don't play a bard with 8 charisma.
No.
is that bad metagaming or is that good metagaming?
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. You be the judge for that. So I think, and sometimes I do think that metagaming can enhance a certain, like, you can enhance a genre feel with that knowledge. If I'm playing like a Blade Runner game, and I do not accept the cybernetics part of the world,
right?
Just because my character wouldn't know about it, like sure, you're not metagaming, but by not metagaming, you're kind of hurting the experience for yourself.
Yeah.
So my point is, you can't stop metagaming, number one. So why bother? And number two is, there are different ways you can use metagaming to be better for the game. So yeah, to metagame or not to metagame, I mean, for me, go right ahead.
Right.
Go right ahead. And it's more interesting to think about how you can use metagaming to enhance the game rather than thinking about the ethics of metagaming.
Right. Is this the thing that's going to serve our table? Like,
right.
Yeah, like when we did the Manchin, I can't remember if I did or didn't, but when you guys asked, like, what the hell's a Manchin, I probably should have just told you, think Terminator. And you would have clicked. It would be metagaming in the strictest sense of the word.
But
that would be a fun thing to do.
Yeah. And I had this experience once where I was playing 5e. I was a player in that game. And I think we were in a tavern of werewolves or something like that, and we were playing really, really late. We were like, I think 5 hours in. It was like probably like 11 p.m. on a weekday. On a weekday. And the impression that our characters got at the time was that we've never seen werewolves. We've never fought werewolves before. And one of our players was like he got knocked down by the werewolves. And as a character at the time, we would have thought, let's just kill every werewolf and just die trying.
Yeah.
But as a player, I felt that these are werewolves. You're going to be here all night.
Yeah.
We're going to be here all night
We've been
without
playing for
silver
5
weapons.
hours.
We've been playing for 5 hours. We have to go to work tomorrow. So instead of fighting the werewolf, I say we're going to drag that one character down and we're going to get the hell out of that tavern.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did was metagaming.
Yeah.
I metagamed that I knew we were not going to survive this fight, or if we're going to continue this fight, we're going to take another 5 more hours.
Right.
So, and I did it for the benefit of the players.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an example of metagaming, but for good reasons.
Right.
And not tell and I didn't even tell like the other players like we're not going to survive this because the MM says werewolf blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I just used my metagaming knowledge without saying anything and just did it.
Yeah.
So if I said something, then that would probably have been bad metagaming on my part, because that would have been spoiling the DM's fun.
Right.
Like, oh, I can slaughter these guys. Coming back to my point, you can't stop metagaming, and if you have the power, use it for good.
Use it for good. I like it. So, too much of a good thing, possibly. I love doing this pop-up in my video editing because it takes me like 20 minutes to line all this nonsense up. Tokens, minis, maps, paraphernalia. Extra tokens, accessories, battle maps, war maps. I got very vocal again with Thomas. Drawing a battle grid just gives me so much PTSD. I did concede, if it's a large table, I probably would use the tools available to me. He made a fair point. How do you feel about these things?
I used to be very hesitant to any game that insists that they must use it. Looking at you, NDS. But then again, I think there's 2 different ways to look at this. One, is it a game that insists that must use those tools and tokens and paraphernalia? NDS is not only the certain example. I think the other one I can think of maybe is Dust City Outlaws. I think that's actually more closer to board game than RPG. Although that's actually a very interesting game because I'm not exactly sure where does that really fall in that strange overlap between board game and RPG. But that one feels a bit more RPG, more board game to me, and therefore that's a game that has board game elements and therefore tokens, paraphernalia, trackers, and that sort of thing. So again, that brings me back to that argument. Like if the game is made for tokens with tokens, then fine. I mean, that's just the game, and you kind of have to accept that or not.
Right. You've already bought into this concept.
Yeah. So you kind of have to roll with it in that sense. Like if you're gonna be complaining about the game having tokens, that's probably not the right game for you from the start.
Right. If you don't want to track like momentum in Star Trek, then why are you playing Star Trek?
That's exactly the other point I was trying to make. Is your game, is tokens and paraphernalia, all this enhances the game. D&D is actually a very good example in the sense that like I've never played D&D with minis till 3.5. We've always played combat.
Roll20 came out.
Yeah. 4 and 4 is a perfect example of the game where you must have the game was built for miniatures.
Right.
Whereas 3.5 was arguably not. Same could be said for 5e, but that's another topic. Probably not want to go into.
Well, we'll do that next time.
Yeah. So like token, like momentum and threat for 2D20 was a game that you could, if you didn't want to use any tokens to track your momentum and threat, you could just have a piece of paper and you just write the numbers down. So I think the purpose of tokens, and you kind of have to figure out what the purpose of the tokens are. Is it necessary, or is it just to make things easier? So I think I as strange as it may sound, I may actually be more favored towards games where the tokens are built into it, rather than games that that encourages token use. Because then you're kind of being misled by the game.
Sure, like inferred have a mini kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Like D&D could say you don't need minis to play the game, but the combat system is designed in such a way that we have to measure everything by squares. That's incredibly difficult to play without minis.
Right. And really, really hard to play without the battle map. That's why all of my 5e happens pretty much on Roll20.
Right. So I would say that's mean-spirited. That's a mean-spirited way to design the game.
Right. And the combat system is like they don't mention needing to do this thing, but it ends up being a necessity.
Yeah, having a necessity to do that. Rather than we use this for this reasons.
Right.
So go buy those things because you need to play. You needed to play, not because you needed to track things.
Right.
And that's the other thing about tokens and paraphernalia. I feel like they also like what kind of purpose they serve, in the sense that are they mainly for tracking purposes, or are they or do they have a different purpose altogether that's not tracking related?
Right. Like, is there a gameplay feature that's being explored?
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's the one where I say that feels a bit more board gamey rather than RPGs.
Right.
Because I don't think any game, except maybe the NDS dice, like that's just a thing by itself that you can't even take. You could take a same-sided die and try to like do that, but you're just making life very difficult for yourself for no good reason.
You're like 1 and 2 is this, 3 and 4 is that.
Yeah.
5 is this, 6 is blank.
I think there's an app for that. I think they actually have an app for that.
I think they do. Oh, God, I remember I tried to memorize like the different like Star Trek roles on the D6. That was horrible.
The Star Trek was the other one that I initially had problems with, but fortunately that one wasn't too hard to translate because it was only a D20 and only a D6.
Right, it didn't get too cute. And thinking of being cute and the necessities, let's talk dice, my favorite thing to end off as we hit the hour mark. So, I like this question. All of the dice, all of the time. So, such as a game that requires the standard 7 set, or Roll for Initiative on the dice shop selling those 15 sets. Kaplau with their D30 and the D9.
So I'm a bit interested in why you asked this question, because is your concern, or the thing that you're asking, is it the dice types, or are we talking about number of dice, or are we talking about how often do we have to roll the dice?
So for this, it's an extension of the concern in the extra tokens and stuff. Is the level of investment and the amount of buy-in required to play RPG games.
Right.
You know, like 5e is very cool for walk into the local game shop, pick up a pack of 7 cool-looking Call of Cthulhu dice for relatively cheap. Q Workshop, I'm looking at you. And you know, walk out, go play your game. Versus something like Slay, you're a little bit hard-pressed to buy 7 D10s. that requires a bit more effort.
Yeah. I was actually, this was like really way back when I just started. It was notoriously difficult to get anything besides a D6. There was no market, no shop that we could go walk into to get a set of Portfolio dice. So, and I'm not gonna lie, that was actually the appeal of playing D&D. Oh, look, we get to roll all these funky dices.
Yeah, like wow.
I'm so
imagine playing Monopoly with one of these D20 things.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm so cool. I have one set.
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely.
So I'm not gonna lie
as well. I lived with D6s my whole life until I discovered that magical shop in the corner that sold incense, weird spirituality books, and D&D.
Yeah. That kind of happened to me too. Although it was Magic the Gathering.
Oh yes, and Magic the Gathering. I forgot.
Magic the Gathering, D20 dice, and for some reason, golf paraphernalia. So I used to be like, if anything, because when some of us, when we were playing back in the days, we were like, well, we should design our own game, because every 10-year-old. Every 10-year-old kid always had that dream at one point. And then the cool thing we were saying, like, if we made a game, we will only use D6.
Right.
Yeah. So that used to be a problem, and I was like, I tried to like keep that spirit up. But now dice is just so easy to get nowadays that I just don't think that's really a problem anymore. To like, you could just go online and just buy dice. Whether the
Right.
dice was fake or an actual dice was a different matter. A China-made dice or a game science dice.
Right, right.
Uh, yeah.
You go on the
So
Etsy, like, this guy's made it in his garage.
yeah. So dice, I think I don't have as much of a problem with. I'm not a dice collector myself.
Right.
I've probably used the same dice for the last 20 years as the numbers dwindled. They disappeared at some point. So when I saw that question, I was thinking about the how often do we roll? Do we roll dice for everything?
That's also another question I did want to ask in this vein. So it's like, we have our standard set. It's like, are we going to be rolling these all the time?
Right. And I think this was a conversation I had with Runesling at the time that when we look at dice, it sort of brings out our instinct, like it's cool to roll dice. We want to roll dice in a game. That's the reason why we're here.
It's like
it's a role
thing.
It's a role playing game. I know.
Playing. I roll the dice.
We both an L and an E, but the L is also important. But like I said, this was one of those questions where you say you go back to rule 0, you go back to the text and you see what they say about rolling dice. Which is something I think, like I said, it's educational because once you go and read what it says on dice rolling, what it represents, what are the expected results, what does this dice represent in the case where games where you roll different types of dice, or you roll different size. The size of the dice pool also is an interesting indication of what is it representing. How do you interpret the dice results? Is it just plain success failure? Is there a degree of success and failure, or maybe the dice result is not telling you whether you succeed or not, but it's actually moving the narrative forward in a different sort of direction or in a certain direction that you are expecting it to be. So that I think is also comes back to the whole generic thing. Like if you're rolling the same, if you're doing the same thing 50 ways in the same way, that gets boring quickly.
Right.
And it's interesting to see how you can do 50 things in 50 ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but for me, it's check your rule book, see what it says, figure it out what it's really saying, and maybe you might find out that it's doing things in a different way, and you'll be surprised.
Yeah. Maybe you should challenge yourself to do it the right way.
Yeah.
And then when you roll the dice, and we see if it's successful, and if we buy into the old school revival propaganda or not, do you prefer to have binary outcomes or degrees of outcome?
There was a time when I would have said that the binary outcome is a very antiquated idea. We should stop looking at things with binary success failures. And it was kind of strange to think like that at one point, because especially as a critique to D&D in particular, because D&D still had a crit success and a crit fail.
Yeah.
It was not exactly binary. There was yes, no, and then awesome and lousy.
You're right.
So that's where I started leaning towards, degree of success kind of games. Star Trek Avengers being, the typical example for that. And
yeah,
Star Trek example is definitely not the first. There were games that done way before that. So, but I've come to realize that there's actually benefits to binary success failure models and degrees of success failure models. Like the reason why D&D and the D20 system is so easy to grasp is because it's easy to grasp. It's success or failure. Yeah. You don't have to think about, how many degrees of success there are in the range.
Make the number or don't make the number. Roll the 15.
Yeah. The failure of that system, I think, is prepping or giving advice to the DM on how to handle that. How to handle success and how far that success should go, and how to handle failure or in preparation for failure. Like some DMs, you still see some DMs having the habit of I'm making you roll because I think it's right to roll, but they've never thought about what happens if this roll fails.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
So I think that's just more of a how the rules is presenting the system rather than the fault of the system itself.
right.
But at the same time, why I came to appreciate degrees of success kind of systems is because I want the roles to matter, like the numbers that you get to matter, and also because when you are not given the right guidance of what success should look like, and you are thinking, okay, I'm thinking of 3 possible ways this could succeed because the player just says he wants to roll. He doesn't tell me how he wants to roll. I rather have the system guide me through that process of thinking of what are the possible successes and then letting the dice decide which success they can get. I think PBTA to some extent practices this. Star Trek Avengers definitely was the one.
I forget which one it is. I think it might be Desolation has like no plus complication.
Right. Yeah.
It's got like various things like that.
Yeah. So that's where I felt I like those systems only for its storytelling potential. It's more interesting and it keeps things flowing in a different way,
right?
Rather than saying you fail, nope, we stop here,
right,
and go figure out something else.
It really hurts the momentum of the narrative,
right? Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, you could still fail. You could still fail with degrees of failure, and you could say we don't stop here, but something else happens.
Right. It's like
yeah.
I like that idea. It was, I think, again, also it was Desolation. It was like it's not a total failure. There's some opportunity in the failure.
Yeah. I mean, I think the term was failing forward, and failing forward was as a concept was introduced to me in D&D times where even though it's somebody fail, you keep pushing the narrative. But there are definitely mechanics that actually have this built in. Like this literally means you fail, but you move forward. Right. Again, Star Trek Adventures also has like a specific rules for that. Of you didn't fail, you succeeded, but with cost.
Yeah.
It's a different way of
success at
cost. Success at cost, which is like a different way of failing, but you still keep the narrative moving at that point. So again, look at the system, what it says. You might find it strange that certain systems that push for a certain way, and it's like totally the wrong way to go for that system, for that setting. Where nuance is all about it's all about nuance, but they go with a binary system, and it can work in the opposite way as well.
Right, and I thank you for your time. I think our narrative is going to have to end at this point. And then the next go around we'll talk about prep. We'll talk about how it depends how you want to do it.
Yeah. Looking forward to that one when it comes around. Looking forward to anyone who joins in this series of interviews.
Yeah, I'm keen to try and connect to people like outside of the circle that I immediately have and tentatively put my foot into joining the community.
Because that's the thing. I mean, like, it's not really about what we say. It's really about what we have to say. It's all about bias and preference. And knowing everyone's bias and preference is the one I think like that's more interesting than just telling me an answer.
Right. More interesting than just tell the player to get stuffed and rip up his sheet.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Casey.
All right. Thank you.
Jim. All links in the description. Once again, as always. Go subscribe, just like me.